One of the greatest moral panics in the modern history of the United States has been the marijuana moral panic. Marijuana used to be legal, and in fact, farmers were legally mandated to grow it in the 1600s for the fiber, hemp, that it produces. In the 1600s, hemp would make things like paper and clothes, just to name a couple. Then, in the 1800s, marijuana became renowned for its medicinal properties. In fact, during the first Anti-Drug Act in the United States in 1914, Congress proposed to ban marijuana, but so many people protested the ban that Congress listened. A few years later, marijuana became especially popular in the 1920s because it replaced alcohol during the alcohol prohibition. It was used mostly among the African American community on the jazz scene and also among Mexican communities. The alcohol prohibition came to an end in 1933, and during this time, the Great Depression had already begun. Moral panics emerge through a triggering event, and in this case, the marijuana moral panic was triggered by the Great Depression. With so many Americans out of work during this time, the ethnic groups known to take the lowest paying yet most plentiful jobs in the country, namely African Americans and Mexicans, were scapegoated as the cause for the Great Depression. What many believe was an attempt to open the job market for desperate white Americans, President Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, which mandated marijuana laws that imprisoned many African Americans and deported many Mexicans. The marijuana moral panic was implemented through propaganda that encouraged American citizens to reject marijuana.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these. Of course, if you're afraid. That's better. That's more like it. I know you like that. Really, you will. Now just take a puff of that.
Right here, to your knee. The next tragedy may be that of your daughter, or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours.
The main moral entrepreneur of the marijuana moral panic was William Randolph Hearst. He owned the timber industry and also several newspapers. He put anti-marijuana announcements in his newspapers, obviously because hemp was in competition with his timber industry for paper. Those who benefited most from the marijuana moral panic was the timber industry, since timber replaced hemp to make paper. State governments also benefited from the marijuana moral panic because each person imprisoned in their native state generates thousands of dollars per year from the federal government for that state in order to house and feed the prisoner. If one thinks about the unspeakable number of African Americans and Latinos who are in prison today because of marijuana law violations, it appears that the social consequences of the 1930s marijuana moral panic are still thriving today. Another industry who benefited immensely from the marijuana moral panic was big pharmaceutical companies. As aforementioned, marijuana has extremely healing properties to it. The compounds, or cannabinoids, in marijuana have been proven to treat Parkinson's disease, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and other neurological disorders, insomnia, inflammation, digestive disorders, depression, rheumatism, migraine, fatigue, constipation, diarrhea, parasites, and appetite disorders. It is also effective for pain relief and can be used as a bronchodilator for the relief of asthma symptoms. What many consider the most amazing healing effect of marijuana is that it has been shown to shrink tumors and kill cancer cells. It also treats various psychoses, so contrary to the moral panic that declared marijuana to encourage violence, it actually promotes peace in those who ingest it.
When I first started the practice of cannabis medicine, first of all, my family, friends, colleagues all thought it was a terrible place to go. And the reason I went into it, the most important reason, was that I just could not get my hand to write Xanax and Vicodin and Valium prescriptions any longer. I just couldn't do it. It's not that those medications are all bad. There's nothing that's white or black. Everything is gray. But for somebody that has insomnia or has anxiety and certainly pain, to not try the safest thing on the planet makes no sense. I mean, the fact that people, like almost everybody's okay if somebody's dying and they have cancer, they have HIV, and they have weeks or months to live, that it's okay then to use the safest medication that we have on this planet. But for young, healthy people who could getting addicted and going to rehab every few seconds in this country for prescription medications, it's not okay. So that's what drew me into it. And the results that I've seen have been way beyond what I could have possibly expected. I mean, before I started working on cannabis medicine, I really wasn't thinking about tinctures. I knew that they existed, but I had no idea that I could give somebody a few drops of a tincture and they walk in with a cane, literally. I mean, hundreds of patients like this, or with walkers, and by the time they leave, I mean, I don't want this to sound too much like a Jesus save thing, but they forget their walkers. They forget their canes. And that, I mean, how much pleasure can you possibly, get as a doctor out of that? I mean, it's just unbelievable. And then these patients, they realize, and this has happened dozens of times, and they walk back in and they had this like white look on their face. And initially I was concerned when I thought, are you okay? Did something happen with the tincture you bought and took? And they say, no, I just can't fathom that I'm walking. Cannabis is just such a wonderful gift because it can be social and it can be medicinal and it can't harm people. And there is, I mean, can people abuse cannabis? Of course. I mean, anything can be abused. Now, addiction of cannabis is extremely rare. But the current term, addiction, is that you're using either a medication or an activity, it can be a lot of different things, where you're actually continuing to take that medication or engage in that activity for its side effects, for its bad effects. For example, if you've got the typical, stoner who every morning they're totally sober, but they're making a decision to use cannabis to avoid dealing with life. They're using it for its side effect, its ability to zone you out. But how to get well, how to deal with your pain, how to deal with your anxiety without getting altered is the trick. I've spent the majority of the last 4 years anyway helping manufacturers and local organic farmers develop tinctures, concentrates of cannabis that are actually very dilute. I should be very careful about saying they're concentrates. They're almost in not true homeopathic doses, but sort of a homeopathic dose, very low dose. And patients put this underneath their tongue, they swirl it around their mouth, they take a few breaths, and they do not get altered. They don't get stoned. They just get well.
Dr. Frankel is right. Marijuana cannot harm people. Several studies have scientifically proven that marijuana is not addictive. It is impossible to overdose on marijuana, and one does not even have to smoke it to ingest it. Marijuana compounds can be extracted and transferred into edibles, tinctures, or vaporizers. In fact, one of marijuana's compounds, called CBD, when separated from the compound THC, actually alleviates psychosis rather than encourages it. Because of this, CBD strains of marijuana are even prescribed as an anti-anxiety remedy, without the effects that prescription drugs induce. These findings show that the marijuana moral panic was way out of proportion to the real threat that marijuana poses, which, when compared to many, many other legal substances, is null. So why the unreasonable fear? From these findings, it is apparent that the moral panic about marijuana was started as an effort to land jobs for white Americans during the Great Depression and as a way for William Randolph Hearst to profit even more from timber by kicking hemp out of the competition. But fortunately, corporate and government agendas can change, and so can the entire world.
In terms of legalization of drugs, I think that the battle, the war on drugs has been a utter failure, and I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our marijuana laws.
I understand when they say we're born again, 'cause I've been born again. I'm born again, and it's amazing. It's the best thing. It's glorious. It's life-changing. This feeling is amazing. It's the best thing.